Every day, you and I get bombarded with negative news. And just like our bodies becomes what we eat, our minds become the information that we consume. If you want to stay positive, it's so important that you also listen to stories that inspires you and uplifts you. In this podcast, we interview world-leading experts dedicated to solving the world's most pressing problems. And if you stick around, I promise you will not only be as informed as if you watch the news, you will feel uplifted, inspired, and have more positive energy in your life. Welcome to Great.com Talks with. Hi and welcome. Today Great.com talks with Joe Quirk, who is the president of the Seasteading Institute. And he's also an author and a real cool world, an aquapreneur. It's the first time I've heard of that, because the Seasteading Institute is an organization that wants us to reimagine what civilization could look like by assisting in building floating cities that would have significant political autonomy, and thereby an aquapreneur. So I'm really excited to speak with Joe today. And if you haven't done so before, you definitely want to press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because that will help us get this interview to more people that can be inspired by the prospect of a new kind of civilization. Yo, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with Gray today.
Thanks for inviting me, Emil.
So I was so excited when I did research. So tell me about seasteading. What is the idea here?
Seasteading is homesteading the high sea. And everybody has ideas for how society could be engineered, but it's very hard to change old societies. And people talk about going to Mars, and Elon Musk recently put out a statement that SpaceX is going to make its own laws on Mars. But we have a planet much closer where we can do this, and it's called Planet Ocean. The oceans are more than twice the size of all the land on the Earth. And it's a canvas where we can put startup societies. And in Silicon Valley, people love the idea of startup companies. You know, Apple wasn't founded from within Hewlett Packard. Steve Wozniak had to leave Hewlett Packard to create Apple. And then that changed the world. And we need to do the same thing for governance. And the technology to float societies on the ocean is here. It's been demonstrated to work. You can remain stable on the high seas. And so we want to create startup societies on the ocean. And seasteads are a technology to solve two very big problems. One is it's a technology for you to voluntarily create your own startup society and see if you can attract people to move there. And it's peaceful, because if it fails, you go bankrupt. And if it succeeds, you build prosperity and more people can attach to your city. So it's a way to innovate in governance and discover better ways of living together for more diverse kinds of people. And the only reason we need to fight is because we don't have any choice. The other problem seasteading solves is that it's the next step beyond sustainability. It's environmentally restorative. And every seastead you build increases the amount of life on the ocean. So imagine if you could tell people, I'm going to sell you a single family house. We're going to float it on the sea, and a coral garden will naturally grow on it. Barnacles will grow on it. It'll be a fish aggregation device. An ecosystem will grow on your seastead by itself, and it'll be something you can farm. It'll be a garden. Boats have to pull themselves out of the water and scrape barnacles off and get rid of all the seaweed and all that, because all that life impedes its ability to move. But if seasteads float permanently on the high seas, you can grow a coral shell around it naturally in the water, and animals will attach, and this will become a garden. So seasteading is a way to restore the ocean environment, experiment with peaceful startup societies. And it's the best, most hopeful thing going, because we're starting in 2021 and we need to get the message out.
Wow. I've never heard of this idea before. It sounds it's so creative and so new. So help me understand then, what is the challenges you guys are facing? Because why hasn't this been done before?
You just articulated the only remaining challenge. The only reason this hasn't happened is because so few creative people have understood it. And we need to get the message out that this is happening. It's starting in Panama. They've already started building the first Seapod, they call it. A company called Ocean Builders is in Panama, building the first seastead. And we're making steps, baby steps, to move out onto the high seas as quickly as possible. And the way this happens is you need to attract lots of creative aquapreneurs to get started out there. You need marine engineers, which we have. You need maritime lawyers, which we have. But now we need the regular people that are going to build, the guy who wants to cut people's hair, the person who's going to babysit your kids, the person who's going to open a restaurant. Those are the type of people we need to attract to the first Seasteading Society, which is starting in Panama. I run a nonprofit, which two-person staff and dozens of devoted volunteers who see this as the path forward for the future to solve two of the biggest problems in the world, including sea level rise. Our next goal is to create the legal ecosystem for seasteads to float on the high seas. And to do that, we need what's called a flag of convenience. You need some sort of flag. So a flag of convenience is not the same as a normal territorial flag. So if I'm on the soil of Panama and I'm flying a Panamanian flag, I'm under the laws of Panama. But if I get a flag of convenience for my cruise ship and I take my cruise ship to Alaska and a fist fight starts on my cruise ship, or an elderly lady has a heart attack, I can't call 911 back to Panama. I have to provide governance on the ship. So a flag of convenience provided for ships offers considerable leeway for people on ships to govern their own floating cities, and cruise ships essentially are floating cities. So the effort of the nonprofit is, if we sign on the dotted line with a respected flagging registry for a special seasteading flag that's designed for individuals and for homes on the sea, which is then I think seasteading can start on the high seas. We can start experimenting with superior societies, and you can get your allies together and see if you can form a better society. The trick is you have to have a business out there supporting your life. You have to build your own society out there. And we're starting with the minimal viable product, which is the Seapod, which should be comparable to the average American or European home in terms of price, something a family could afford. And we want to start selling these to people, to start building sort of like a Venice out on the ocean, to start the aquatic renaissance. Except imagine all those little islands in Venice, they can move around and choose new societies. So if you don't like one society, you can vote with your house and move to another. And this will start an evolutionary process of variation among societies and selection by customers, buying governance. That's the principle of evolution right there, variation and selection. And that was the idea that hooked me, that realized we could apply the principles of evolution to governance itself if we seastead.
It's so cool that I just imagine if the houses in Manhattan could move around if they needed to be somewhere else, because that would be more convenient. And that's really the kind of options you have then. Yeah, it's a mind-boggling thought. So what other advantages do you see by being self-governed? Like, what is it a new society can do from your point of view that is not possible in the old societies?
So people for decades have been discussing better ways of governing ourselves. And you can go on the internet and they're just numerous. There's things called futurarchy, and there's smart contracts, and there's blockchain governance, and there's all sorts of ideas people have. Ocean Builders wants to form a cryptocurrency incubator on the cruise ship. But there's no place for people to try out these ideas. So, because all land is claimed by governments that hold a monopoly on land, and they won't let you completely reconceive society from the governance up. And there's tons of great ideas out there. There's no place to try them. So to return to my analogy with Steve Wozniak, he proposed the idea for a personal computer 5 times to his superiors at Hewlett Packard. And all 5 times they said, I don't see why people would want a personal computer. How is it going to work? How are we going to make it cheap? It doesn't make any sense. He was forced to quit Hewlett Packard and go found his own company. And his design became the first design for the first Apple computer. If he had not been able to break away and try something new, we would not have Apple as it exists right now. And I'm using it right now to talk to you. So the solutions that will solve the governance problem, the solutions that will solve sea level rise, and the solutions that will solve the environmental problems are not solutions that we're arguing about right now and that somebody's going to get power and impose it on everybody. They're going to be discovered among thousands of people trying different things. And only the ones that work will be the ones that others choose, and many of them will fail. But we need to create the research and development zone on the high seas to discover better ways of living together. And the governance options that solve problems in 2050 will not resemble the ideologies that we have available to us today. There'll be something no one is thinking of, just like no one thought of how a personal computer could work.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there. Like when there's so much history already in a society, it becomes locked in a certain way. So to be able to start over, I can really see the power of that. And I would also enjoy having the freedom of being able to more, dock to a society that works for you, depending on the project you want to take on, where you're at in your life. So what kind of risks do you see with this? Because imagine you have a seasteading society, and then all of a sudden a nation state says, well, actually, we kind of think that water is ours. Do you see those kinds of risks? Or what could go wrong?
Those kind of things can go wrong. And the advantage that seasteads have is that they can move. So if we start a seasteading community off the coast of Spain, and then Spain changes its mind and says, we don't like that you're setting a better example, seasteaders can move their city blocks. There's a company in Holland called Blue 21 who have an ambition to get 1 billion people on the ocean by 2050. Wow. And they make the point that in a floating society, there's no need for demolition. Because if a building doesn't work, you can kind of float it out and move it elsewhere, and you can move something else in. It's like a floating jigsaw puzzle. And if each of these people individually control their own city block, they can vote as a group, individual houses, they can move elsewhere. So you can imagine this society where people can move around and choose the kind of governance options they want. That will incentivize people to innovate, to attract people to themselves, and there'll be a natural market competition out there. So one of the analogies I use is a shark and a cleaner fish. So it's quite true that the Cayman Islands has no standing army. There's tens of thousands of people that live in that country. At any moment, the United States could get annoyed and just take over the Cayman Islands. But they don't, because the Cayman Islands provides services that powerful people in the United States appreciate. So if the nation state is like a shark, you, as a seasteader, you want to think like a cleaner fish. You want to cleaner fish go inside the mouth of the shark, and they clean the shark's teeth, and they don't get eaten. So you want to provide a service that the world appreciates. And that also goes for a country like Trinidad and Tobago, which is like 6 miles from the coast of Venezuela. But Venezuela doesn't invade and take. don't provoke the big countries, and think of yourself as like the way cruise ships have grown. Initially, in the 70s, people could have complained a lot about cruise ships. They're only for rich people. They actually have butlers. Um, they're skirting all sorts of laws and governing themselves when they go far away. But they just sort of slowly grew, and people decided they like cruise ships. So now the powerful countries of the world can't really just go out and take over cruise ships because everybody likes them. And I think seasteaders have to take the same approach. You don't want your first seastead to just, have child slavery and sell drugs. You want it to be an algae farm that provides jobs to the poor, that creates an environmentally restorative society, that people like to go and visit, and they want to be in the underwater rooms and live on the CB&B, which has been proposed. And if you create a benevolent society out there that people can see is superior, I think seasteads could change governance on land as significantly as Hong Kong changed governance in China, or as significantly as Singapore has set an example for the rest of the world, or Estonia has adopted things like the flat tax, which changed a lot of countries in Europe by setting a better example. It's always better to demonstrate than to argue your point. You want to demonstrate that your political system can work.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that attitude. And yeah, I mean, why not? I feel, I really hope you guys can encourage and inspire others and get the support you need to do these experiments and demonstrate that this is possible. I would be open for living in a floating city. I have like 35 more questions, but we only have 3 more minutes. So instead of asking them, I'm going to ask, what is the future like for your organization? Like, what kind of timeline are we looking at before this comes a reality? And also, what can someone do to keep up to date, keep following this project and see how it plays out?
Well, step one is answer the 26 most popular questions that get asked about seasteading. And I made a video series called Tough Questions Answered.
Mm.
And they're like 2-minute videos answering every question people have. What about pirates? What about tsunamis, hurricanes? And then we just explain how it works. And when you watch that video series, you start to see that the type of solutions humanity is looking for is always something out of the box. And yet it's right in front of you. It's the ocean. And the ocean has so many advantages that the land doesn't have. And our land-based way of thinking keeps us thinking inside the land-based box. And so the Seasteading Institute and what it's prepared to do is the best path forward for humanity. So here's the steps that I imagine happening. The Seasteading Institute hopes to go 12 miles out, which is just outside territorial waters, and park a sea pod out there with a flag of a registry that agrees to define a seastead in international law. And then you have a couple people living on that thing. And news crews come out there and they go underwater and they look out the window at the aquarium apartment you're living in, and they see the coral growing and they say, wow, cool, isn't this neat? And then more people maybe build more and you get a village out there. Then more serious people get involved. Naval engineers come in and say, hey, I think we could make a profit if we go a little further out and build a seaweed farm. I think if we get outside 20th century regulations and build 21st century fish farms with Buckminster Fuller shaped cages that free float on the ocean, that's featured in my book. There's all sorts of ideas that people are not able to push forward because the technologies of the 21st century need to get beyond 20th century regulations. 2035, you have lots of floating societies out there with a wide variety of them. And people say, this is interesting. Some of them fail, some of them succeed. I want to start a new society. I'm going to go out there and experiment. And then next thing you know, a country like Kiribati, which is sinking below sea level, asks the world for help. They bring in seasteading technology. they transition to being a floating society. Then there's an argument in the international community that, well, what about babies born on seasteads? Does Kiribati lose its exclusive economic zone just because they're no longer islands, now they're floating islands? And if they decide no, Kiribati maintains recognition as a sovereign nation, even though they're now floating, what if somebody else builds another seastead next door? What if babies are born on the seastead? Are they stateless? The United Nations has a whole department devoted to the prevention of statelessness among children. And I have lawyer friends eager to make the case in the courts of international law that we have a humanitarian case, that these should be recognized as sovereign societies that are essentially startup societies. And this is how we unleash on the other half of the planet that we're not paying attention to, voluntary societies. On land, we have these primitive governments that are based on force, top-down force. And on the ocean, 21st century governance based on bottom-up choice. And all you have to lose is your investors' money and your reputation. There'll be little incentive for war, just like there's little incentive for cruise ships to start wars with each other. There'll be a natural market of governance providers on environmentally restorative societies, absorbing carbonic acid from the water, improving the local waters where we establish them. And the first aquapreneur I feature in my book is Ricardo Radulovic, who wants mass seaweed farms on the ocean, which will absorb nutrient pollution and carbon from the ocean. And he wants to move, the farms in Iowa out onto the ocean. Seaweed's more healthy and more environmentally benign than corn, wheat, or soy. And we can create a completely different kind of civilization that's so different. I call it civilization. I try to come up with new names for things to get you to think outside how you think. We're stuck in old paradigms, and we conceive society on the other 2/3 of the earth.
Wow, this has been very interesting. I have been touched by your ideas, and I will definitely contemplate and spread the word. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your ideas with us.
It's really gratifying to hear you say that. And seasteading would not be happening without Bitcoin and without donations. So my institute is supported entirely by individuals who see this as the next path forward. And we need to get the message out, and we need to negotiate with flagging registries for a respectable seastead flag. And then we can start this new society. So right now, it's a nonprofit effort to create the ecosystem legally and environmentally for companies to start building these things on the ocean.
Jo Quirk, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
And for you listening, if you found this interview as interesting as I did, press subscribe on YouTube or your podcast app. That will show the algorithm that this is important and more people can hear about floating societies. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.